I'm Andrew Gustafson. I'm so happy to be joining with all of you on this Veterans Day. And so, as Cindy said, we're going to be exploring some areas in and around Prospect Park that commemorate World War I, which is, of course, the origin of Veterans Day, formerly known as Armistice Day. I am out on the street, so there will be some other noises, and we're also contending with the weather. We'd actually planned to do this tour on Veterans Day all the way back in January and February when we were putting together our Prospect Park tour calendar for the year. And so we're doing it virtually now. I'm kind of glad we're not doing it as a in-person tour, just because the weather is going to be very unpredictable, but I have an umbrella, so we'll try and stay dry. But we're here at our first stop, which is the 14th Regiment Armory. So I'm standing in Park Slope. I'm on the corner of 15th Street and 8th Avenue. And so you can see this huge castle-like structure that's behind me. Maybe some of you have visited here recently to vote. If you live in the area, this is our early voting site, or maybe you go to the YMCA. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of the armories and their role in World War I, and also talk about the memorial that's in front of the building. I'm going to kind of walk and talk, and Cindy has just dropped in a link to a Google map if you want to follow along our route, or if you want to walk along it yourself later on. But we're not going to go in front of the building and actually see the monument that's up close, but we have some pictures of it. And the reason why is because, we have these armories all over the city, and now they're used as these civic buildings for various purposes. And today, this building is a shelter. So we just want to be respectful of people that are living here. And so we're not going to walk in front, but here you can see this image of that famous doughboy that's in front. So I'm going to make my way down 8th Avenue. We're going to head over to Windsor Terrace and Prospect Park West, as you can see here on the map. So we'll get back to the doughboy in just a second, but as we're walking along here, I just wanted to walk you through what we're going to see and talk about today. So first, we're going to walk down 8th Avenue a bit, and then over to Prospect Park West. We're going to look at some memorial trees that we have that maybe you've walked past, maybe you've never noticed before. Then we're going to walk through a memorial square, also with its origins in World War I, which is Bartel-Pritchard Square. Then we're going to cut across the park. We're going to make a quick stop at the entrance to the Quaker Cemetery. And then we're going to go around Lookout Hill, and then we're going to end the tour on Prospect Park Lake and visit the Brooklyn World War I Memorial. So that is the main memorial for the First World War in the borough of Brooklyn, which commemorates the lives of 2,800 people in uniform who were killed during the war. So that's kind of the route we're going to take. And so we're going to talk about the history of commemoration of the war. But we're also going to talk about the ways in which the war impacted the city and Brooklyn specifically, and the park even more specifically. The ways in which the park itself was actually mobilized for the war effort. And so we're starting at the Armory. So Cindy, if you could pull up that picture again of the doughboy. So here again, you probably, if you don't know anything about New York City's armories, you've probably seen them all over the place, these massive, massive fortress-like buildings. I'm just coming past the school right here, so you might hear some kids in the background. But these massive fortress-like buildings, most have their origins back in the Civil War. Most were built after the Civil War, but they were built in part in response to a law passed in 1862 by the state of New York called the Armory Law. And essentially, the state encouraged municipalities to build these armories in urban areas in preparation for mobilizing for the Civil War. And these became even more, sorry, it's crossing the street here. The need for these became even more acute of course, after the draft riots in 1863. But most of them were built much, much later. And so we built these massive buildings for storing equipment and doing indoor drilling for military units. But of course, America didn't really go to war in any significant way for a few decades. So they kind of became these, very large, very expensive, almost like clubs for military units. And so the one here in Park Slope, this is the 14th New York Infantry Regiment. And so it was completed in 1895. So again, significantly after the end of the Civil War. And as I said before, many of these buildings have been repurposed for lots of different civic uses. The Park Avenue Armory, hosts all sorts of events and art shows and things like that. Some of them, have been turned into housing, like the one on Claremont Avenue in Fort Greene. And then, of course, the one here, the 14th Regiment Armory is now a YMCA, and it's also a shelter for New York City Homeless Services. But in front of it,
Andrew, it's also where early voting took place this year.
Yeah, I mentioned that. Yeah. So we voted there in the primary, but in the general election, I think we had over 60,000 people that were assigned to that one polling location. So it was actually a lot faster to just vote on election day. But anyway, back to the Doughboy. So this has really become the kind of symbol of World War I commemoration across the country. And there are many different variations of doughboys. This one was carved or created by a sculptor named Anton Schaff. And as far as I know, this is the only copy of this version. He did make other World War I memorials, but many of the doughboy statues you see around the country have been duplicated. So some designs were more popular than others. So if we can jump to the next slide. So for example, this one on the left, this is actually near my hometown. This is in West Haven, Connecticut. So this is another one of Schaff's designs. On the right, you can see here probably the most popular design of a doughboy really in history, which is Duquesne's, it's called The Spirit of the American Doughboy. So this was actually first installed in a city in Georgia, which is where the sculptor Duquesne is from, but it was duplicated by him well over 150 times. So he was very, very successful at marketing his design. It's argued that this one on the right is the second most viewed statue in the United States, although most people probably didn't notice it. That was maybe true 100 years ago. I don't know if it's still true today, but there are still today over 130 exemplars of this still standing in municipalities across the country. And it was widely duplicated as statuettes as well. So hugely, hugely popular. And it's thought that it ranks behind only the Statue of Liberty in its sort of recognizability. So if we go to the next slide right here, I want to show you another famous example of a doughboy. So this one, we just want to give a shout out to our friends in Pittsburgh. This is the Lawrenceville Doughboy, which we got to visit earlier this year. This one is also very popular, not because it was replicated many times, but it's because it's really become a symbol of Pittsburgh and especially the Lawrenceville area. The neighborhood's sort of unofficial logo is actually the head of this doughboy here. It has been replicated though. If you look on the right, this is our friend Rob Steiner, who runs a 3D printing studio in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And he made a 3D printed copy of it. So that thing on the right, it looks like it's made of bronze. It's actually all made out of plastic. And he made a copy of it, not based on the Lawrenceville version, but on the version that is in Rhinebeck, New York. So they did a digital scan of it and then 3D printed it in pieces. So things like the bayonet and the helmet and stuff like that are removable. So, you know, these are just a few examples of these different doughboy designs. We have many, many, many different versions of them just here in New York City. But this is the one that's closest to the park. At the end of the tour, like I said, we're going to see the World War I memorial, and it is very, very different from any of these doughboy examples that we've seen thus far. If you're familiar with it, you know what I'm talking about, but we'll save it to the end to take a closer look at it. But if we could just take the slide down, Sind, because I want to show folks what's in front of me right here. And again, apologies for my fingers in the camera, but we're standing here now on Prospect Park West. So we're looking now towards Greenwood Cemetery, and Prospect Park is behind me. But I want you to notice all of these flags along here. So these were placed by the American Legion post. I believe that they were actually placed by the Dory Miller post, which is the one that's inside the 14th Regiment Armory. But where they've placed these flags all at these plaques right here. So we actually have 14 of them all along Prospect Park West, and we'll take a closer look at a few of them and talk about some of the people that they commemorate. But these were all placed in 1919, 1920, 1921, actually placed by the New York City Parks Department. And this was actually a huge effort by the Parks Department to place these plaques and to plant memorial trees for actually every single Brooklynite killed in the war, and even some people who weren't from Brooklyn. So we have about 2,800 Brooklynites that were killed in World War I, and we had about 3,800 memorial trees planted. Now here in Prospect Park West, this was actually not one of the original locations for these memorial trees. Originally, they were all planted along Bedford Avenue. We'll take a look at one more right here. So they were planted along Bedford Avenue and along Eastern Parkway. Now, what happened to all of these plaques? So as I said, there were nearly 4,000 that were placed. Within about 3 years, by 1924, and again, apologies for the noise, we're gonna be in the park soon, so it'll be much quieter. But by 1924, most of the memorial trees that they'd planted along Bedford Avenue died. They died because it was an inappropriate species that they chose. It was actually a type of Asian plane tree, a type of sycamore, and they couldn't handle the winter. So within about 3 years of planting all of those trees, they all basically had to be taken down because they were dying. And so the plaques along Bedford Avenue were moved mostly to Eastern Parkway. I'll be completely honest, I don't know exactly when these 14 plaques were placed along Prospect Park West, and if there's any reason why these particular ones were placed here, although many of the people that are memorialized here actually grew up right in this immediate neighborhood. So several of them actually lived on Windsor Place, which is the street we just walked down on 8th Avenue. Maybe we can pull up that slide, and we can look at some of the records here. Yeah, so here we looked at this Thomas Gaynor. You can see he was in the 316th Infantry, and you can see right there, he lived on 210 Windsor Place, which we just walked right past. You can also see the date of his death, which I believe it's November 5th. Is that right, Sin? Sorry, the captions are just covering my screen a little bit.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so just 6 days before the armistice is signed. And we'll notice that a lot with the people who are commemorated the people from Brooklyn who died in the war. Huge numbers of them died just in the last few weeks of the war during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. So this massive push in the fall of 1918, and many of the units that were, sort of born in Brooklyn, and I'm just going to take my umbrella down for a second. Many of the units that were born in Brooklyn, and some of them actually born out of the 14th Infantry Regiment. I say born out of because these units were essentially militia units, and so they were reorganized into the regular army and renamed. So many of them actually went into the 27th Division. So some of the units you may have seen on the plaques, including the 105th Regiment, the 106th Regiment, they were actually in the 27th Division. Yeah, is there a question, Cindy? Yeah.
Yeah, so Andrew, Howard, who's joining us today, says that he had an uncle who was in the Army toward the end of World War I, who while in service died of the Spanish flu pandemic. And he said that he had one of these trees planted in his honor. He's memorialized on a World War I. He said he is also memorialized on a World War I monument in Ridgewood, Queens on Myrtle Avenue.
Oh, wow. Wow. Yeah, I wonder if Howie knows if he is on the main memorial in Prospect Park. If you want to drop the name in, we'll see if we can find it on the wall.
Yeah,
thank you for sharing that. Yeah, so that's something we definitely have to mention, which is the impact of influenza. So many of these people, when you look into the records, that's what they died of, as the disease kind of ran rampant through American encampments. Oftentimes when you look at records like this one right here, you can find some of these on Ancestry.com. Many of them, they cite the cause of death as pneumonia. And that is, the sort of direct cause of death that was caused by influenza more often than not. So we actually, we did a program earlier this year about World War I and Greenwood Cemetery. And one of the memorials, which is sort of another Doughboy statue. I don't have a picture of it, but we can share it later. But there are a pair of statues that are busts of the individuals who died. And one of them, I believe his name was William Sarlo, died of influenza. Yeah, so it's something that had a huge impact. You can also go back, we did a program that was about the hospital ships, the history of hospital ships in New York. And certainly, there were a lot of personnel in the Navy, not just the Army, who also contracted the flu, and they were treated here in New York aboard some of those hospital ships. But I'm going to show you one more thing before we go into the park. So this is Bartel-Pritchard Square. Bartel-Pritchard Square is notable because it is not a square, it is a circle. But this is one of the traffic circles sort of on the corner of Prospect Park. And it's named for two individuals who served in the 59th Coast Artillery. So they were also killed in the later stages of the war, and I can tell you, I wish we had pictures of these individuals, but we actually don't. So they're actually, memorialized with a, pretty significant landmark here, but we actually don't have pictures of either of them. So Emile Bartel, he died age just 23 on September 23rd, 1918. And then William Pritchard died a little over a month later on October 28th. So again, just about 2 weeks before the end of the war. What's interesting about Emile Bartel is that he is one of the people who actually had their remains repatriated, which is something that was relatively, it was, you know, a little less than half of the Americans that were killed in the war actually had their remains repatriated. And again, this is something that was pretty new in World War I. You know, in the Civil War and the Spanish-American War, the Mexican War, it was common for Americans killed in far-off battlefields. They would be buried, you know, where they fell. And that's what they did in the early stage of the end of the war. Actually, in 1918, 1919, America, you know, was starting to build these cemeteries in France and Belgium, and the French government actually prohibited the repatriation. You could not ship bodies out of France. And so eventually the French government relented, and the US government did a survey of families, you know, of over 100,000 families that had lost loved ones in the war. And the majority of them responded that they wanted their remains repatriated. So, you know, we have about 116,000 Americans that are killed overseas in the war. About 76,000 of them could have their remains identified. And of those, about 46,000 were actually repatriated. So if you do the math, it's about 40% of Americans were repatriated. So, you know, if we count Bartel and Pritchard and add it to the 14 other names that we have commemorated along Prospect Park West, by my calculations, only 3 of them were actually repatriated and buried back here in the United States. But yeah, Cindy, maybe you can pull up that image so we can take a look at, you know, what a big deal it was to commemorate this site. So you can see all these people gathered, and, you know, you can see here I'm standing in front of those columns that you can see in the photo at the entrance to the park. So, you know, what's interesting about this square is that it's named after 2 kind of, you know, ordinary soldiers who were seemed to be very, you know, well liked by their fellow soldiers and their officers. You know, but they're representatives of the thousands and thousands of Brooklynites who died in the war. You know, again, this is something we've looked into and haven't been able to find a really good answer for why these 2 individuals were chosen. It seems to me that the 13th Avenue, the 13th Regiment Armory, which is over in Bed-Stuy, their American Legion post was named after these 2 individuals because their unit actually came out of that armory. So it seems that it may have been the influence of this particular American Legion post that influenced the decision to name it after these individuals, because they weren't actually from this immediate area right here. Yeah, and so just one other thing I wanted to mention is, you know, a handful of these people, we are able to find images of them. So Cindy, if you want to pull these up. Oh, there we go. Yeah, so these are a couple of people that are commemorated along Prospect Park West. So we have, look at my list here. So we have James B. Kelly. Yeah. So he was killed on August 28th, 1918, age just 23. And the other person we have here is Anthony Ham. Don't know his age, but he's killed on October 6th. So again, in the very last weeks of the war is when we see most of these casualties. All right, so we're gonna make our way into the park. And I wanna kind of step back in time a little bit. If we could pull up the image, Cindy, of the encampment on the Long Meadow. So I want to talk a little bit about the America's entry into the war, and, you know, the role that these units that we had here in Brooklyn played. So there you can see the 14th Infantry encampment. So this is in June of 1917. So The war obviously breaks out in the summer of 1914, but the US doesn't get involved for almost 3 years. There were a lot of reasons that America eventually enters the war on the Entente side or the Allied side. In part, it was for freedom of the seas. German unrestricted submarine warfare definitely played a role and influenced the United States to enter. But when we immediately enter the war in April of 1917, America needs to do something we've never done before, which was raise an army of about 2 million men and send it across an ocean. So this was a huge, huge task of logistics, of manufacturing for all of the supplies that were needed, but also of recruiting, getting young men to sign up. And so these armories became a kind of center of that recruiting drive, and Prospect Park was as well. So it's estimated something like 60,000 people attended this encampment that they held, where they basically just set up tents all along the Long Meadow to get people to sign up. So this was really one of the biggest recruitment events in Brooklyn in the early stages of the war. If we go to the next slide here. So this is a few weeks later. You can see another big recruitment event and patriotic speeches being made down at the parade ground on the southern end of the park. We can go to the next one. Now, this is a representative photo. This is not a photo of Prospect Park, because unfortunately we don't have a photo of this particular display. But this became a really popular thing during World War I, and it was popularized actually by these two photographers, Mole and Thomas. But this making these living flags, so they'd have people stand in an arrangement to make a picture of some kind, usually an American flag, or it might be the Statue of Liberty, or it might be a Blue Star banner for families that have children serving overseas. But what's so neat about it is the way they use this forced perspective, because it's a pretty sharp angle that they're taking this picture at, but they bunch up the people at the back to basically make it look like you're looking at the flag straight on. So you can see there's 3 sailors in the front that are lined up, but there might be 10 or 20 in the back at the top of the flagpole. So anyway, they actually did one of these living flags, probably not as large. This was done at the Great Lakes Naval Station, basically the boot camp for the Navy in Illinois. But so this was part of the display as well. And we can go to the next slide. Now, of course, the most famous recruiting event or recruiting display in New York City was the USS Recruit. They actually built a giant fake wooden battleship in the middle of Union Square. So the Navy actually had a number of really dramatic displays. They put a captured German submarine on display in Central Park, and they had this big wooden battleship. So we didn't have anything quite like that in Brooklyn or in Prospect Park. But this is, when you think about World War I recruiting drives, this is sort of one of those iconic images that comes to mind. Yeah, so we can come back to me and I can just say a little bit about where we're walking along here. And if there are any questions that have come up. All right, so I'm walking along the West Drive right here. And if I look to my right, I'm just gonna flip my camera around. Up here, we can see these woods over here. And we're going to come up to the center drive in just a second. But if we go a little bit deeper into these woods, there's a fence because this is a little piece of the park that's in the park, but not of the park, so to speak. And that is because this is the, we're coming up to the area of something called the Quaker Cemetery. And so the Quaker Cemetery is this unique little piece of the park. It's about 10 or 12 acres. And it was actually established before the park was. So it predates Prospect Park. The Quaker meeting established a cemetery in part in response to, the need in the middle of the 19th century to basically stop burying people in Manhattan. So all of these churches and burial societies and other religious organizations need to find other places to bury people. And so they bought this plot of land and what back then was, farmland basically. And they established their cemetery. And so this was kind of right smack in the middle of where Brooklyn wanted to build its park. And so they decided to just leave them. And so it's sort of this little carve out that we have in the park. But it's actually not park property. It's also not accessible to the public. So we're not going to go inside today, but I did want to tell you a little bit about it and the history of it that relates to the First World War. So maybe Cindy, we can pull up the next slide. So this is one of the people that is buried in the cemetery. Her name is Mary McDowell, and she was a Latin teacher at Manual High School, which today you may know as John Jay High School, right here in Park Slope. And Mary McDowell, being a Quaker, she was also a pacifist. And she did not believe in really doing anything to promote or support the war. So she refused to promote the selling of Liberty bonds. And she refused to engage in patriotic songs or speeches. And as a result, she was suspended by the New York City Board of Ed. She appealed her suspension and her suspension turned into a firing, but she did, it actually dragged on in a very, very long court battle. And it's actually believed that this was the first court case in the United States by an educator who was seeking legal redress because of discrimination over pacifism. And so this court battle actually dragged out for several years until 1923. So it actually took 5 years when she was finally reinstated to her job at Manual High School. So we're coming up right here. Cindy, if you could come back to my camera, I'll just show you the entrance to the cemetery. So again, if you are wondering where we are in the park, so we're on the center drive, sort of right off the Nethermead, and we'll just take a quick peek inside here. So again, there's a fence. This is private property. And you can see it was established in 1849 to 1851. So this is right around the time 1847 is the Rural Cemeteries Act in New York State, which essentially outlaws burials on the island of Manhattan. So I wanted to show this because, we've talked about military units. We've talked about, battles, people, killed in war. But it's really important to remember what an absolutely dreadful thing war is in general, and World War I in particular. And that World War I had extremely, let's call it deleterious impacts on freedom of speech, many basic fundamental freedoms that we hold dear in the United States. During World War I, we essentially outlawed the right to criticize the war, criticize the president. And these laws, including the Espionage Act, were essentially used as cudgels by the Wilson administration to attack their political opponents. So it was used to, attack unions. It was used to attack basically anybody who disagreed with the president in any way. So it was really, really nasty and terrible. And it's actually this governmental overreach, this real abuse of power that sparked the creation of the American Civil Liberties Union to defend some of these people. And many of the people who were persecuted were also people who were objecting to the war over religious conviction. And it wasn't just Quakers. For example, Mennonites were persecuted across the country, and they kind of had the doubly difficult position of being both pacifists and also being German speakers. So it's a really, really interesting history. And we have this little piece of it with Mary McDowell being buried here in the park. So I think it's a really important part of the history. And I don't want to just make this, just all about, the conduct of the war. But Cindy, was there a question?
Yeah, so Chris is wondering whether the cemetery is ever open for tours.
I don't believe so. As far as I know, if you want to visit the cemetery, you have to know someone, and they do have, family events and things like that. But you have to know someone. So they keep it very private for obvious reasons. So just to orient you a bit where I am. So I'm just crossing the Nethermead. So we're going to go a little quicker as we make our way. We're going to go over a place called Breeze Hill and down into Concert Grove before we get to the main memorial. But as we're walking along here, I wanted to talk about a few other ways in which the park was transformed during the war. And Cindy, maybe you can pull up the picture of Lookout Hill. I'm going to flip this around here. Yep. Yeah, no worries.
Just a second here.
So up this way. So to my right, we have Lookout Hill. So that's the highest point in the park. Oh, I just lost it. And
oh, sorry about that. Andrew, are you there? Oh, I think Andrew is muted. We're just going to unmute him here for just a second.
Oh, okay. You got me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, we just lost the slide, Cindy.
Yeah, I'm going to pull it up in just a second.
Yep.
I just wanted to show people where you were.
Yeah. So, okay. Thanks, everybody. We're also entering an area of the park where there's a little worse reception. So just bear with us. But once we get to the other side of the lake, it should clear up. So Lookout Hill, highest point in the park. You can actually see the Atlantic Ocean from here on Lookout Hill. And so what do? They built an observation tower. It's not clear from the records if this was ever actually used by the military, but it was put up in the winter of 1917. And then, within a year, with the end of the war, it's basically abandoned and then torn down a couple years later. What's interesting is that under the original plans of Olmsted and Vaux, they had planned to build a beautiful sort of Gothic style tower on top of Lookout Hill. It never got built, essentially because the park ran out of money. And so instead we had to have this rustic observatory, it was called, instead, which was, you know, commandeered by the military and then torn down. So we don't have an observation tower on Lookout Hill, unfortunately. But another big change, if Cindy, we could jump to the picture of the lions. Another big change in the park was that the park had long wanted a zoo. And in the 1890s, they actually established a small, what they called a menagerie. So just kind of a series of small cages. Animals were donated by people who'd gone on safari and things like that. But as a result of World War I, Prospect Park managed to get you know, a real big zoo animals. This is because the Bostock Menagerie, which is a traveling zoo, and it actually, you know, been in Coney Island. And when World War I broke out, it was actually in England, and they lost their grounds as a result of the war. And of course, lost a lot of their customers as well. And so they decided to sell off the animals. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle, the newspaper, got word of this, and they immediately set up a subscription drive to get people to sign up and raise the $3,000 to buy a good chunk of the menagerie, which included seven lions. They managed to raise the money in the span of about a week or two, and then the animals were loaded onto a ship, sent to Philadelphia, and then brought to Brooklyn by train. And so that was the beginning of the zoo. Now, this is in the winter of 1914. So they have the animals. They actually don't have a zoo for them yet. It takes another almost 2 years to actually, or a year and a half, to actually build a zoo building for them, which you can see right here. In the meantime, some of them were held in the small menagerie cage, and some of them were actually sent to other zoos, I believe Central Park Zoo, for safekeeping. And so this is kind of the first formal zoo that we have at the park, which comes about as a result of all the upheaval in Europe in World War I. Then, you know, about 20 years later, in 1935, this building would be replaced by the zoo that we have now. All right, so I'm just coming over Breeze Hill now. We're going to be down in the Concert Grove in just a second. And there's actually a reason why I wanted to go to the Concert Grove specifically. And that's something I made reference to before, you know, talking about persecuting people who were German speaking. You know, in World War I, we had this wave of anti-German hysteria. And, you know, you can see this in the landscape all across New York City if you know where to look, because many institutions had their names changed. We had streets whose names were changed, you know, banks, hospitals, because, you know, Germans were a huge part of the immigrant community in New York City, huge part of the cultural life, not just in New York, but all across the United States. They're really one of the largest immigrant groups in the country. And then all of a sudden, you know, anything German is considered the enemy. And so you see not only people voluntarily changing names in order to kind of avoid the backlash, but you also see, you know, outright attacks on people and places. And actually, if we could pull up the picture, Cindy, of Germania.
Sure, I'll look for that for you. Hold on.
Yeah, it's the picture of the statue.
There's also a
sure.
He's just mentioning that they're interested in cemeteries, that they grew up in Glendale on a dead-end street. The dead end was the north end of Cypress Hills Cemetery.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll take a look and see if I can find that for you.
Yeah, I mean, Cypress Hills is notable too, because of course it has one of the national cemeteries. All right. So we're in Concert Grove. If you don't know what Concert Grove is, this was actually established as the main concert and music venue for the park as part of Olmsted and Vaux's original design. So this is where orchestras and military bands would come and play. And so I'll get back to this. We can pull up this picture in just a second, Cindy, because there's actually something I want to show right here. And if you come into the Concert Grove, you'll see many busts. And I would say that these are some of the most enduring symbols we have still in Brooklyn of that German civil society that was so vibrant before the First World War. So we have a bust of Beethoven over there. We have a bust of Mozart over in this direction. We have a bust of Weber, Carl Maria von Weber. If you see here, you can see presented to the city of Brooklyn by the United German Singers of the city, first prize of the 17th National Sanger Fest held at New York in 1894. So these German singing societies were a big part of cultural life, and they largely, disappeared or were renamed after the First World War. What's interesting is that, I tried to look and see if there's any record of there being outcry, against all of these German composers commemorated here in Concert Grove, and I actually couldn't find any evidence. And in fact, all throughout World War I, the concert series here in Prospect Park continued to feature the work of German composers. So it seems that this attack against all things German didn't extend to classical music. But yeah, Sind, why don't you pull up that slide? We're almost at the memorial, but I just want to show you, one of the most visible symbols of this anti-Germanism that you can find in the city. So if we pull up the picture of Germania, Sind. Yeah, so this is along the Customs House. And if you join our program in a couple of weeks about Cass Gilbert, we'll talk more about this. But there's a series of statues along the cornice of the Alexander Hamilton Customs House on Bowling Green. And so they represent the trading nations of the world, and one of them is Germania. And so this was carved by a sculptor named Albert Jägers. And if you look at the shield, what you can see is that it says Belgium. So in 1917, the city ordered that a stonemason go up there and turn Germania into Belgium. So Belgium is now supposed to be one of the great trading nations of the world. So you can actually see this from the street, and we'll talk in a minute about another one of these statues along the top of the building. But we are coming up to it right now. So if you cut back to me, Sind, we're going to come up to the memorial right now, and that'll be our last stop. So there you can see in front of me. So to the right, this is called the Music Island, and we're coming up along the shore of the lake. So this memorial was actually originally conceived in 1918. And the belief was that the main commemorative site for those killed in World War I should be Prospect Park. Now, originally there was a proposal, and I apologize for the shaky camera. We're going to get closer in a second, and I'll stop. But the original proposal was actually to place this on the Long Meadow. That was rejected, and instead they found this location here along the lake. So I'm going to stop right here, and we're going to just take a close look at the main figure here of this really, I think, one of the most beautiful and haunting war memorials in all of New York City and perhaps in the country. Now, what I said at the beginning of the program was that, when we were looking at those Doughboy statues, we're going to see something that looks very, very different at the end of the tour. And so here it is. So this was carved by Henry Augustus Lukeman. And what you see is not a doughboy in a triumphant pose, you know, with a bayonet ready to charge or waving his hat in the air. What you're seeing instead is a soldier with a shattered rifle. So some people look at the statue and they think it was actually damaged, but this is part of the original design. You can see the barrel is broken off and the stock is shattered of his rifle. And he is being taken by the angel of death. I think one of the most amazing details, and I want to give a shout out to the Prospect Park Alliance archivist, Amy Peck, for noting this, is the incredible veil, this beautiful, delicate carving of the veil over the angel's face. You can see here. Let's see if I can get this up here a little closer so you can see. How does that look, Cindy?
Looks, yeah, it's very clear.
Okay. So this was not the first memorial to the war that was erected in the park. In fact, in September of 1918, they put up a temporary memorial and had the names of just 356 people, Brooklynites killed in the war. So, you know, that says two things. Number one is, you know, it was, I think, hard for a lot of Americans before the fall of 1918 to appreciate the massive scale of the war and the huge toll that the Meuse-Argonne offensive had taken, you know, was not made publicly available just yet. And so all of a sudden, you know, we have the number of people that are killed jumped from 356 to over 2,700. So I saw, Cindy, that how we shared the name of the person that we're looking for here.
Yes, that's right. We're looking for John Daub.
And how do you spell that?
D-A-U-B.
D-A-U-B. I don't, oh, there we go. I found it. You see it right there? John Daub, right there.
Yeah. Howie is also saying that he was born in Wyckoff Heights. He just said, wow. That he was born in Wyckoff Heights Hospital in Bushwick, and that the hospital's name had been changed from the German hospital built in 1894.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Same thing with Lenox Hill Hospital. Also had its name changed, as well as there was a medical dispensary on 2nd Avenue in the Lower East Side. Is that right? Or in the East Village, which is now known as the Stuyvesant Dispensary. It was the Deutschland Dispensary. It's now a New York Public Library. But yeah, so a couple things about this, this memorial. So this was actually completely 100% paid for by one person. The benefactor was William H. Todd, who was the owner of the Todd Shipyard. Obviously did a lot of work during the First World War, building and repairing ships. And so he donated the full sum of $35,000 to construct this memorial. And so, you know, this was known colloquially at the time as the Todd Memorial. And we have a couple pictures we're going to show here. Oh, actually, let's, this is actually another memorial here in the park, which was dedicated in World War I, but actually isn't to World War I. This is showing the dedication of the Lafayette Memorial, which is over on 9th Street. We would have included it in the tours. It's a little too far to walk today, but I'll drop it into the Google map so folks can check it out. So here you can see the Lafayette Memorial. If we jump to the picture scenes where we have the Genoa the Genoa statue, I just want to mention something about the sculptor. So many sculptors were considered actually for this commission, including Daniel Chester French. But the person who got it was Henry Augustus Lukeman. And this is another example of his work that you can see in New York. He did the sculpture of great trading nation of Genoa. And so he did a sculpture of Christopher Columbus, which is on top of the Customs House building. You know, Lukeman is an interesting figure. You know, he's perhaps, you know, best known for being the designer of one of the worst monuments in America, which is Stone Mountain, the largest monument to the Confederacy. So he actually created the design. He did not complete the carving. He was fired, just like his predecessor, Gottsom Borglum, who also, you know, who's famous for doing Mount Rushmore. He was the original artist who got the commission for that. So, you know, sort of a, he has a questionable portfolio, but I think, you know, this is really his crowning achievement. It's really one of, I think, one of the most remarkable works of sculpture, and you know, really my favorite of the hundreds of World War I memorials we have in New York City. This is by far my favorite one. So I think we're just about out of time. Is that right, Sind? So I just want to thank everybody so much for joining us today. And if there are any last questions that you have, again, I hope that this was an informative and interesting way to spend Veterans Day. But I just want to mention that, you know, America is unique in the way that we commemorate Veterans Day. You know, this is the day of the armistice. World War I ended 102 years ago today. And so this has been known as Armistice Day. It's now known as Remembrance Day in the Commonwealth. And for every other country in the world that marks this day, it is a day of remembrance of those who have died. In America, we already had a day for that, Memorial Day, which was born out of the Civil War. And so instead, we took November 11th as a day to celebrate the veterans who are still with us. And so although today's program was about memorialization, I just wanted to highlight that. And you know, if you know a veteran, you know, today's a good day to give them a call, say thanks, and you know, just to remember again those people who serve their country who are still with us today.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for putting this together. I just want to share a few comments that have come into the chat box. One from Phyllis. She said that she liked that women and men are listed on the Prospect Park Memorial. Hazel Foster is listed, and she died of the 1918 pandemic, and she had her training at Methodist Hospital.
Oh wow! Let's see if we can find her
Foster.
name. Oh, thank you so much. Oh, here it is, right here.
Oh, amazing! I'm going to remove my spotlight so people just see your view.
Mm-hmm. There you go.
Oh, amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for pointing that out.
Yeah.
You know, I've gone through and identified a handful of people that we were able to, you know, fill out their story a little bit, but that's not one that I've noticed before. So yeah, so one of the rare examples of women who not only served in uniform, but also served overseas. There were only a couple of places where you could do that in World War I. So one was to join the Yeomanettes, which was the women's Navy auxiliary, or you could become a nurse. Yeah. So yeah, we have a question. We can open it up. Send.
Okay, so Rebecca has patiently had someone named Rebecca's had their hand raised. So I'm going to allow Rebecca to talk if you're interested in asking a question. I know we have some people that are calling in different ways, but I will.
Yeah, and I know we're over time as well, so but we'll stick around to answer any more questions. But don't feel like you have to stay.
Yeah. Phyllis was just saying, she said, I stood at the memorial at 11 a.m. on November 11, 2018. for the centenary, only 2 of us were representing.
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a, it's a time period and a conflict that has started to fade from the public memory. I guess it was about, I think 2006 was when the last American veteran of World War I passed away. And, a lot of our programming, a lot of our research is focused on the Second World War. And we're approaching that as well. We're losing so many World War II voices every year. Maybe some of you joined the program we did last night with the Center for Brooklyn History, where we listened to oral histories from their collection. And of the 9 people's voices that we listened to, I think only 2 are still with us. Yeah.
Well, people may not realize this, but in addition to the Prospect Park tours, some of you may know us that way, but we also do tours at the Brooklyn Army Terminal, which was where soldiers returned, but it was also a major debarkation point for people whose remains were returned. It was
So it sort of it played that role at the end of World War I. Actually, the last American remains that were repatriated after World War I came to the Brooklyn Army Terminal, but it really fills that role in World War II. Sorry, it's just starting to rain again. But yeah, and we're hoping that you'll be able to join us in the park for an in-person tour. But we're also hoping in the next 2 weeks that we're going to relaunch the tours of the Brooklyn Army Terminal as well. Again, like Cindy mentioned, smaller scale, more socially distanced. And I see Phyllis just mentioned that her father commanded Fort Hamilton. That's amazing. So one of the units that we mentioned before, the 59th Coastal Artillery, that was based out of Fort Hamilton. So that was the unit that Bartel and Pritchard served in. And of course, Fort Hamilton has a number of World War I memorials, including a major one here in Brooklyn, which is the Dover Memorial as well, which is right down at the end of Fort Hamilton Parkway. Yeah.
And I think, one thing to underscore is that this was actually a tour you wanted to give for Veterans Day this year. For like a year, you've wanted to do this in person, but we're so grateful that all of you joined us virtually. And who knows, maybe we will do this socially distanced in person in the future. But in the meantime, you can use the Google map that we sent out. We'll also be following up with everyone with a Google map where you can go out on your own and maybe even listen to this as you go along and do the walk yourself and get a look firsthand.
We'll also drop in to the webpage where you signed up. Whenever you sign up for one of our virtual programs, we put links from the program back into that same webpage. So you can go back to where you signed up. And we'll also drop in the virtual tour that we did of the Battle of Brooklyn in Prospect Park. And we'll also include a map of that. So, you can enjoy a self-guided tour at your leisure, whether you want to explore the World War I memorials or the Revolutionary War memorials. So thank you. And thank you so much, Cindy, for helping behind the scenes and doing all the technology. I got my hands are kind of full with the rain and stuff. So thank you so much to everybody for joining and have a great Veterans Day. Yeah, you want to mention something?
That's a very, very kind request, which is, she said, where can I give you a good rating? What sites? You can review us on Google, or you can review us at TripAdvisor or Yelp or wherever you review things.
Yeah.
If you review things, but all of those definitely help us. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Great. All right. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.